Hello, welcome to The Nation. I'm Jessie CHAHAL. Now, with the upcoming visit of Chinese President Xi Jinping to Malaysia, attention is once again turning to the long-standing and evolving relationship between both nations, a relationship that spans over 5 decades of diplomatic engagement. From strategic partnerships to economic cooperation, the Malaysia-Chinese relationship is one that stems decades. And joining me in the studio today for this conversation is none other than Professor BENG, Professor of ASEAN Studies at the Institute of Islamic Civilizations and Thought, or the ISTAC, International Islamic University of Malaysia. Welcome, Prof, and welcome back, I must say. Things are definitely heating up here in terms of conversations we've been having during this week with the announcement or the tax sort of approach from President Donald Trump in the US, but now also zooming in into a Malaysia-China relationship. It's a dynamic relationship that we have within the region as well. Questions are, what does this signify in terms of the current geopolitical landscape with what's happening around the US announcement as well?
Well, what is peculiar about the current age is that the geopolitical dynamics is actually evolving almost on an hourly to hourly basis.
Right.
Some may say that that's an exaggeration, but I don't think so, because you have a personality such as Donald Trump, who has very short sleeping schedule and has a tendency of resorting to tweets, to making all kinds of statements even in the middle of the night. And as and when he does that, it's a potential bombshell. So when you have a president of the United States that behave in such a manner, and all his remarks and speech acts are taken very seriously by the market and by the rest of the world, then obviously it's going to increase the fluctuation in the geopolitical dynamics. Insofar as Malaysia and China relationship are concerned, it's extremely stable. Over the last 50 years, you have seen nothing else but an ascent and an attempt to even climb further. So you mentioned that Malaysia and China has a strategic partnership. Actually, we have a comprehensive strategic partnership, which can even go further. In other words, you can add the word advanced comprehensive strategic partnership, and then the relationship will just go on a stronger ascent.
Malaysia, Prof, within ASEAN was the first ASEAN country to go out and establish diplomatic relations with China. We're talking 1974. And therefore, forward to the future, how significant is the President's visit to Malaysia that's in terms of a 5-decade relationship?
Well, the significance of President Xi Jinping's visit, first of all, we have to understand that this is a bilateral visit. In spite of the fact that we are now the chairman of ASEAN, it's strictly bilateral because His Majesty, His Royal Highness, was actually in Beijing last November. So this is actually a reciprocal visit of that royal visit of our king to China last year. But that having been said, what is bilateral can now easily become multilateral, because the situation on a day-to-day basis is now becoming extremely fragile. The international legal order is cracking, and everyone that understands the basic rudiments of international relations will be aware that all the norms and legal rules that have been created in Bretton Woods institution at the end of World War II in 1945, and this is the 80th anniversary, all of that are actually crumbling and cracking. And President Xi happens to be the first leader from the UN Permanent Security Council to make that visit to Malaysia.
So on the back of these cracks that you've mentioned, how does both nations, Malaysia and China, further enhance and solidify their existing trust and cooperation, whether economically or otherwise?
Well, the good thing about China-Malaysia relationship is that there is there are no significant undercurrents, even though you have issues such as South China Sea. Those issues have been well handled by Malaysia and China vis-a-vis, say, Philippines and China, that occasionally get into very severe friction, short of an outright war. So when you have that as a confidence basis, in international relations, you can refer to that as norm setting. So in other words, you have a framework of trying to manage whatever issues that are at hand, but you do it in a very diplomatic manner. And this is also known as defensive diplomacy. Even though you might see the relocation or shifting of military assets to certain areas, it doesn't mean that we are on the verge or on the cusp of war. So when you have that kind of cushion and foundation,
Right.
then the cracks that I mentioned earlier can be further attenuated, because in any regional organization such as ASEAN, it actually derives all its authority from United Nations. So when United Nations or any other multilateral organizations are not functioning well, regional organizations can come in and set the pace and the tenor.
Right, and so as you've highlighted as well, it's a long-standing relationship and one that is built on a foundation that is strong, of course. As we move forward, what would be some of the areas or sectors you think that will be discussed upon the President's visit to Malaysia in terms of further enhancing this cooperation and strategic partnership?
That's a very good question. If we were to go by the policy pronouncement of President Xi himself in November 2023, when he was re-elected for the third term, then 3 initiatives are very important to him. Global security initiative, how to ensure confidence building between member states, global economic initiative, which is actually based on the Belt and Road project that has advanced quite significantly, and there's every likelihood that what is now known as Belt and Road should be further rephrased as digital road initiative, where digitalization might play a more significant role. And thirdly, you have the global civilizational initiative. On the latter, global civilizational initiative, President Xi Jinping's visit to Malaysia has coincided with the signing of an MOU between International Islamic University of Malaysia and the International Confucianism Association, which has a history that goes back to 1994. The whole idea is to, I wouldn't say enmesh, but encourage the Confucian world, comprised of China, Japan, Korea, and the diaspora in nature, to work hand in hand with Gulf Cooperation Council, OIC, and other member states of the Islamic world. And there are 57 member states in OIC altogether. And so Malaysia is the anchor of that.
Right. And as you say that, within ASEAN as well, as they look upon this visit to the country, what is this signaling to other ASEAN country members and the community? Well,
first of all, for what it's worth, President Xi could have opted to remain in Beijing and cancel the whole visit altogether in light of the on-again and off-again trade war that is being launched by the United States, which is not very encouraging. But despite the turbulence that is now seen all across the world, which China will experience the heaviest impact because the taxation is now pegged at 125%. President Xi Jinping has not changed his plan and still insisted on coming to Malaysia. And very soon after, in other words, next month, Prime Minister Li Qiang is also slated to be in the ASEAN Gulf Cooperation Council and China Summit by the end of May. So there is built-in momentum to this visit. And as I mentioned earlier, Islam and Confucian order will try their level best not to pitch themselves against the West, but to seek convergence and agreement.
That will be interesting to see how that pans out.
Yeah.
And what would you say is a significant strategy for them to explore this side of the world, the ASEAN bloc? What would that approach be like in terms of China's diplomatic strategy?
Well, in terms of numbers, the trade relationship between ASEAN and China have already exceeded the metric of the trade relationship between China and European Union about 2.5 years ago. So China is actually coming to a region where they are dealing with the largest trading partner of all the trade relationships that they have out there. If they want to, as President Xi Jinping explained it, tell the Chinese story, that we are a responsible stakeholder, that we want to position China as a very thoughtful and civil international player, then there's no better example than making sure that everyone can use this ASEAN and China relationship or China and Malaysia relationship as the gold standards of how the rest of the world can actually look up to.
And is that the approach, the plan, that by this visit to show ASEAN and the world that Malaysia and China are firm friends and are leading this strategy together?
That is the plan, but unfortunately the crisis and the pressures that are now imposing themselves on the rest of the world are so acute and so severe that it has to go beyond friendship. So all sides have to look at it from a very strategic context. How do we actually put on the same narrative that what we see coming out from Washington, D.C., potentially even Wall Street, are not the true reflection of what United States wants to be, because Trump is behaving in a manner that is anathema to the interests of American people themselves.
We'll take a quick breather. Make sure you keep it locked on right here on The Nation as we explore Malaysia-China relationships and, of course, the impending visit of President Xi Jinping to the nation. We'll be right back.
Dunia sekarang ada pelbagai jenis manusia. Tak semua orang baik dengan kita. Ada juga yang suka menyamar. Mereka ini datang dari setiap penjuru untuk merampas sesuatu yang berharga, identiti kita. Jadi, kita mesti bersedia. Protokol keselamatan My Digital ID diiktiraf di peringkat antarabangsa untuk teknologi keselamatan digital. Barulah identiti kita selamat. Elakkan penipuan dan penyamaran identiti digital dengan My Digital ID. Selamat, pantas, mudah.
Stay ahead of the game with Biz Pulse on Friday. We bring you the latest business headlines, market trends, and in-depth analysis of the week's biggest stories. From local industries to global markets, we are your go-to source for staying informed. Biz Pulse on Friday, tracking the week in business, catches every Friday at 6 p.m. only on Bernama TV.
Welcome back to The Nation. I'm seated with Professor Kim Beng, Professor of ASEAN Studies at ISTAC, International Islamic University of Malaysia. We've been talking at length about Malaysia's relationship or bilateral relationship with China, spanning over 50 decades, but of course also on the back of a geopolitical landscape at this point with international pressures. Prof, moving forward with Malaysia being chair of ASEAN this year in 2025, what role can Malaysia play towards shaping this ASEAN-China relationship even better? We've touched on it a little bit, but in terms of the broader ASEAN-China free trade agreement.
Well, first of all, in spite of the achievement of the free trade agreement that we have seen so far, creating the trajectory and the ballast to reach the status where ASEAN and China have the largest trade volume and value, one has to go back to history and try to understand that between 2002 and 2010, China actually took 8 years to decide whether they should go into a free trade agreement with ASEAN or not. Because back then, in 2002, China and ASEAN's economic development was almost on par, because you are dealing with two separate regions. So in the case of China, you have 1.4 billion people. In the case of ASEAN, you have about half of that. So when you have free trade agreement, it actually creates tension, because there are many sectors in the countries or in the regions that are not very happy with complete liberalization of trade, especially in the agricultural sector.
Right.
So we have come a long way off from that milestone. And starting from 2010 and having seen the fruits of the FDA, China have always been interested in enhancing it further. So now you have people talking about the digital free trade framework. both in ASEAN and also in relation to China. The quirk to all that arrangement is that the United States have something known as Project Clean Network. So as and when you work with China, there is a tendency of triggering that perception in the United States, more in the United States than in European Union, that you are actually docking and locking yourself into the digital technology of China and not trying to work your way with the United States. But given the current sentiments right now in Washington, D.C., it's not that we do not want to, but the West makes it very difficult for us to work with them.
Set the impression or the mindset right here that dealing with a superpower is harsh and is inflexible to a certain extent. Is that still the approach that we should take as we look upon doing business with China?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. The reason I extend that compliment is because we have seen from yesterday that Trump was on the verge of launching an all-out trade war, followed by the countermeasures from President Xi Jinping, where he put the taxation at more than 85%, if I'm not mistaken, against the United States. And that actually led United States to blink. President Donald Trump changed his mind and deferred that taxation program by another 90 days. Had that gone ahead, Malaysia and the rest of the world would have been seeing the cusp of potentially a recession leading to a Great Depression. But we have averted that yesterday. So it was very exciting, but at the same time, the stakes of the high diplomacy have increased, because during the next 90 days, all sides will try to get and extract the best deal, and the United States and China will ensure that they have all their proverbial ducks lined up to be on their side.
It's an interesting game of chess at this point of time. As we discussed in the previous edition as well, it's time for check, not checkmate, but everyone has to check themselves. But coming back to our discussion points earlier, within ASEAN as well, what can we as a whole, as a bloc, really, lack of a better word, utilize China for in terms of technology or enhancement in terms of scientific power?
So, at the risk of sounding too Malaysian, the Malaysian foreign policy is actually a very compartmentalized one when it comes to China. So we have a relationship with China, but at the same time, we focus that relationship in different compartments. So on one hand, we have a relationship on trade, on tourism, even on traditional Chinese medicine, and finally on sensitive issues such as the South China Sea. Regardless of what happened in any one of this pillar, and if you may remember, we once experienced the MH370 that heavily impacted tourism. Irrespective of what might happen in one of the pillars of the relationship, they are not supposed to cascade and cross-infect each and every component of the relationship. So in that sense, Malaysia has a very mature, a very measured approach on how to handle the great powers. But that's the extent that Malaysia is doing with China. If Malaysia can do the same with the United States, compartmentalizing each aspect of the relationship and getting United States to buy into that approach, then the relationship will be much more stable.
Isn't that an idealistic?
That is an idealistic approach. Without a doubt. But that has also been attempted with and succeeded with China, given the fact that China was once considered our communist adversary at one time.
And so also based on that, in terms of both trying to work together, or not trying to, but having a successful relationship to work together, what were some significant points in this past 50 years that has really propelled both nations, Malaysia and China, to progress strongly and significantly amongst each other? or with each other?
Well, if we go according to the biography of the late Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, it was during one of his visits to China in early 80s where he urged the Chinese to cease and desist from further radio broadcasts of any communist message all across the peninsula, Malaya, to Singapore and even to Borneo. And soon after that visit to China, to Beijing, the leadership in Beijing indeed stopped all kinds of broadcasts. And to Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, who at that time still had some emotional attachment to Malaysia, that was considered a major victory. And precisely because of that geographical proximity between Malaysia and Singapore, to the degree that the Prime Minister of Singapore can extract that concession from Beijing, that also was considered a major transformation at that historical point. In other words, we have a country that does not want to export its version of ideological program to the rest of the region.
Just to go away from the topic for a bit,
Sure.
what is the current sort of landscape or relationship between Singapore and China?
The landscape between Singapore and China right now is that, ironically, they feel that China is more pragmatic than the United States as we speak. The reason is because China hasn't withdrawn from any international institutions at all. They haven't withdrawn from World Trade Organization, which is something that is favored by Singapore. They haven't withdrawn from the Paris Accord and all the other institutions such as World Health Organization. Now, the best scenario for Singapore is to have United States complying to the same kind of institutional and multilateral arrangement, so that the norms on how to create a win-win situation can be further enhanced and engendered. So Malaysia has the same approach because our foreign policy is based on a very simple axiom. We do not have any natural enemies and we do not want to create any new ones in the horizon.
We are a friendly
That's right. A trading
country,
nation.
a trading nation, and I think at this point, with the pressures that's mounting on everyone across the globe, it is everyone for themselves.
That's right.
To an extent, but having these bilateral relationships and these strong partnerships will help to enhance both countries' progress. As we look ahead, Prof, how do you envision both nations in terms of evolving in the next decades? As we know, with AI and tech on speed, things are going to rapidly change as well. What sort of key sectors or areas do you think is really going to be mutually important for both countries?
So for both countries, we cannot run away from what I refer to as the 6 A's. Automation will definitely be in the mix. The importance of algorithm in the applications of various apps that are actually embedded into our phone, computers, so on and so forth. We will also be evolving towards an app-based driven economy. Certain things can be bought or purchased directly from China, such as through Temu and Shein, or Alibaba.
Temu?
Yeah, exactly. And then we also have to understand that analysis of big data is getting more and more important for both sides in order to get things right. And we have augmented reality too. You have a lot of students coming from China studying in Malaysia. At some point in time, maybe some of our courses in Malaysia that are offered to the Chinese can be done through augmented reality.
Well, the future is bright, of course, for both nations, and with the impending visit as well of Presidency, we hope that we'll be able to discover more plans that both leaders have. Well, the ties between both nations continue to shape regional cooperation as well as economic progress in many meaningful ways. I want to thank Professor for coming in to share his insights on the significance of the Malaysia-China relations and what we can expect moving forward. I'm Jessie Chahal. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time with more in-depth conversations on topics that matter.